under climate change. So in other words, where should we be directing our conservation resources to try to minimize biodiversity losses due to climate change and maximize biological resilience? And riparian areas, the habitats immediately adjacent to streams and rivers, have frequently been identified as priority areas for climate adaptation. And that's because they are expected to facilitate species range shifts in response to climate change, and also to provide microclimatic refugia from warming, so a place where species can hang out and stay relatively cool as it heats up. So the reason that riparian areas are expected to facilitate range shifts is that they naturally span the climatic gradients that species are going to be following as they move in response to climate change. They run from warmer areas uphill into relatively cooler upland areas. Also, species already use riparian areas as corridors. They're really important movement areas for not only riparian species, but many upland species use riparian areas as corridors for movement already. And so there's every reason to believe that they'll also use them as they disperse as a mechanism of range shifts. Riparian areas are also expected to provide microclimatic refugia from warming because they contain relatively cool, moist microclimates relative to surrounding areas. And that's both because of the cooling effect of the relatively cold water itself that runs through riparian areas, and also from the shading and the evaporative cooling coming from the surrounding vegetation. So for that reason, it's expected to be a place that remains relatively cool as things warm up. And finally, riparian areas are just expected to be really great umbrellas for conservation under climate change for a bunch of different reasons. So first of all, they just feature really high levels of biodiversity relative to surrounding upland areas. There's just a lot more diversity there. And they also provide many benefits to upland and aquatic species. So many upland species use riparian habitats either at different times of the day or season or as part of their life cycle. So it has benefits not just to riparian species themselves. Healthy riparian habitats have direct benefits to their neighboring aquatic habitats as well. So they provide an umbrella for aquatic species as climate warms. And then finally, riparian areas are just some of the very last natural vegetation that remains in really highly modified landscapes like urban areas, agricultural areas, all kinds of areas that are heavily modified by humans often still have some intact riparian left. And so as species are having to move out of protected areas across the landscape to get to cooler natural areas, these are some of the only places they're going to have to move through when they have to cross these kinds of landscapes. So despite recognition of all these values of riparian areas for climate adaptation, there's actually been really few attempts to prioritize specific riparian areas for for conservation action under climate change. And the very few examples that I have found typically use riverine or stream or river connectivity as a proxy for the connectivity of these riparian areas. They also typically don't look at the quality of the riparian habitat itself, which should definitely influence its ability to provide for range shifts and for refugia. So we wanted to try to tackle this and say, okay, well, which riparian corridors are most likely to promote biological resilience under climate change? And there are a couple things that we might want to look for in a riparian area if we want it to help promote biological resilience. We want ones that span climatic gradients. So we want ones that move from warmer to cooler areas so that species can use them to get to follow their shifting areas of climatic suitability as it warms. We also want ones with relatively high canopy cover, and that's because it's been shown that species are more likely to use riparian areas with high canopy cover to move. They're more likely to use them as corridors, and they're also likely to remain cooler because of those cooling effects of surrounding vegetation. We want ones that are relatively wide. Again, relatively wide riparian areas have been shown to promote animal movement and also to stay relatively cool. We want ones with low solar insolation, so riparian areas that are relatively less exposed to sunlight so that they remain cool. And this also provides another umbrella effect for aquatic habitats. That's a very important component of a resilient aquatic system. And then finally, we want ones with very low levels of human modification, ones that are intact, that are in good shape, because those also are more likely to be used as habitat and movement corridors. So how do we identify these areas? How do we map them? First, we need a base map of potential riparian areas, and that sounds very simple, but it's not. The existing maps of riparian vegetation are actually in pretty poor shape. There's a lot of inconsistencies in the data, a lot of data gaps, a lot of errors in existing vegetation models for riparian areas. And so we worked with Dave Theobald, who developed a base layer for us that used only geomorphology and hydrology to identify potential riparian areas. And basically, these green areas here, so the blue are the streams, and the green area here, these are near stream valley bottoms, essentially. These are areas that hydrology and geomorphology tell us are influenced by the stream channel and hydrologic activities associated with the stream, and so we expect that they could provide for riparian habitat. Once we had this base map, we wanted to identify those riparian areas that were likely to promote resilience via all of those criteria we just talked about a minute ago. And there were several technical and conceptual challenges associated with doing this. It sounds simple, but it's not. The very first, both technical and conceptual challenge was simply identifying a unit of analysis. So you could prioritize single 30-meter or 90-meter pixels of potential riparian. You could prioritize patches of potential riparian. You could prioritize entire watersheds. And ultimately, what we landed on was looking at outlet to headwater stretches of potential riparian. And in this way, we could basically look at riparian, stretches of potential riparian at watershed scales. And so, example, here's the mouth of this little Huck 12, this little local watershed, and then here are all of the headwaters in that watershed, and then here is an individual stretch of potential riparian from the mouth to a single headwater of that watershed. And this seemed to us to be the very minimum sort of ecologically and evolutionarily relevant unit to look at in terms of the scale that we expect climate change processes to be happening at, the scale at which species will be moving or requiring refugia. And also it's a relevant scale for management. Most management actions take place at watershed scales. So for a stretch of riparian between the mouth and a headwater of a watershed, we calculated all of those parameters that we just talked about. So we looked at the change in temperature from the mouth to the headwater. We used PRISM, so it's this downscaled historical climate data, and we further downscaled it using Climate WNA. It just uses local topography essentially to downscale climate data to give us temperature along this stretch, and we could look at then the gradient is just determined by the change in temperature from the mouth to the headwater. We looked at the average percent canopy cover along this stretch, and that was using the National Land Cover Dataset's canopy cover layer. Area was simply, the width of that riparian area was simply determined using the footprint of our valley bottom layer. We measured the average solar insolation of that stretch using something called potential relative radiation, which is a unitless measure of solar insolation that you can implement in ArcGIS. And finally, to look at human modification, we used a metric called landscape condition developed by NatureServe, and I'll explain later why we chose that because of our partnership with the Western Governors Association's Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, which I'll talk about later. And that simply, it simply penalizes areas that are modified by human activities versus those that are not. So, and it's an inverse score, so as landscape condition goes up, in fact, human modification goes up, which sounds a little counterintuitive. In any case, we identified and measured all of these 5 parameters, and we did that for every mouth to headwater stretch in that watershed. Once we did that, we could calculate a riparian climate corridor index, a very simple measure of the expectation of whether this stretch was likely to promote climate adaptation or not. And the index was very simple. It's simply change in temperature times canopy cover plus area over solar insolation and landscape condition. And so all you need to know about this is that basically as the change in temperature from the mouth to the headwater goes up, the score goes up. Similarly, as the percent canopy cover and the width of that riparian goes up, the index goes up. The index goes down as you get more solar exposure, and it goes down as you get more human modification. We then had to account for scale. So basically, if we measured it only at that local scale of that Huck 12 I showed you a minute ago, a very local small watershed, that may serve species that require movement in response to climate change at very local scales. It may provide for refugia at very local scales, but we know that species have very different scaled requirements for climate change, refugia, and movement. So we wanted to make sure we were thinking about everything from local to continental scale movements. And similarly, thinking about time horizons. So movement requirements, refugia requirements may be relatively local in the near term, but in the long term, they could be at continental scales. And so to do that, we calculated the index at each nested HUC level. So a HUC is just a hydrologic unit, it's a watershed. So for example, here's our local HUC 12 again. The headwater is a little triangle, and then the little circle up there is the mouth, and the green line is that stretch of riparian between them. We measured the index at that scale. We measured it again for the mouth, for that headwater all the way down to the mouth of its HUC 10, again all the way down to the HUC 8, and finally all the way down until we reached the Pacific Ocean. So we measured it at a range of scales, and then ultimately, this was our study area. We didn't go into Canada for data reasons, but it's Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, hydro region 17. And ultimately, we averaged across scale to get our final index. So here's our riparian climate corridor index. Right here, what you're seeing, these are all points, and those points are headwaters, and you're seeing attributed to those headwater the score for that average of scaled indices. And so, pretty obvious pattern that mountainous areas, the Cascades, the Olympics, the Rockies tend to have a pretty high riparian climate corridor index as opposed to, is there a pointer? As opposed to lowland areas like the Columbia Plateau or the Puget Trough or the Willamette Valley. That's not surprising. Mountainous areas are in generally pretty good shape. We don't tend to farm and live in mountainous areas as much as we do lowlands. They tend to be relatively well shaded from local topography, have more canopy cover. And so for all those reasons, you see mountainous areas getting pretty high scores, and you see lowlands getting pretty low scores. These are in quintiles, by the way. So this is the top, the blue areas are the top 20%, and the beige areas are the bottom 20% scores. If you zoom in here, now we're looking, here we are, hi, and here's the Olympics and the Cascades. Again, these points are those headwaters, but really these scores are for everything downstream of those headwaters at all the nested scales. And so one thing to see here on the coast in particular is that these low scores on the coast are only due to the temperature gradient. So these areas are actually in really good shape, lots of canopy cover, low human modification, pretty wide, but the coast is very cool compared to these very nearby inland headwaters, and so they don't have the climate gradient we're looking for. So in these cases, if you're strictly looking through a climate lens, maybe not your best bet, but there's lots of other values in these areas. And so all of these layers, the parameter values for all of these different, the 5 parameters are available, and I'll tell you where to find them later. So there's not just the final index is valuable, but also the components. Here's another way to look at it. This is actually the footprint, the potential riparian network for the entire region. And the scores here are for each segment of riparian, it's the average score of all of the riparian stretches that run through it. And so this is a different way of looking at the data, although it gives you pretty similar results. One thing that does look pretty different is when you get especially into, so for the headwater streams, those first order streams, you're gonna have almost identical results as those points you looked at. But particularly when you get up into higher order streams into which flow many other streams, you start seeing real differences between the 2 layers, the one I just showed you, because these ones you can think of as providing access to really cool, good condition areas upland of it. So these are areas that you might want to prioritize in thinking about allowing lowland species to get up into the cool, high quality riparian areas and associated uplands above it. And finally, we don't just want to prioritize mountains. That is another scale effect. If we had only looked at the Columbia Plateau, we would have gotten a totally different answer. And so we also looked at these scores within ecoregions. And so now you're looking at the top 20% within the Columbia Plateau and the bottom 20% within the Columbia Plateau. And this is really important because it's really these sort of flat, hammered areas that could really most benefit from having intact riparian areas to help species persist and get out of those areas into cooler areas as it warms. And these are the individual headwater points, and then also we provided it averaged across HUC 12 watersheds within each of these ecoregions. And so just some take-home points. First, I would argue, and others have agreed, that riparian areas really offer high climate adaptation bang for your buck. There's a lot of reasons to be looking to these areas for climate adaptation, and we're just offering one way to help say which riparian areas we might want to look at first. Our analysis is really intended to provide a climate lens for management decision-making and conservation planning. We don't intend this to be a single layer that is used to make decisions. You really need to do some simple validation, even just going to Google Earth first and seeing, is it really what we think it is? Is it riparian? Is it, maybe there's a parking lot there right now. And so making sure to compare this with other available data sets, comparing it with other conservation values. It's just another layer of information that could be used for things like the WGA chat, which is the Western Governors Association's crucial habitat assessment tool. Could be another layer used in that. State wildlife action plans, restoration, planning easements, comparison with other analyses. Could be used by very diverse groups from agencies to tribes to NGOs and others. And just a quick note that it actually does not rely on projections of future climate. So this is one way to use sort of ecological rules of thumb and just our basic knowledge about how things are responding to climate change to plan without relying on future projections of climate. So it removes some of that uncertainty, though there are uncertainties associated with the analysis. It's available at Databasin via the NPLCC, so you can go to nplcc.databasin.org to get this layer and report. And thank you very much to our sponsors.